Hello and welcome back to the Quantum Slumber. In 2022, an 87-year-old man was connected to a brain scanner when something unexpected happened. His heart stopped, and in that moment, doctors accidentally captured something no one had ever planned to record so precisely before: the activity of a human brain at the edge of death. What they expected to see was silence. What they saw instead was a surge. In the 30 seconds before and after his heart stopped beating, his brain did not simply fade into darkness, it lit up. Gamma waves, the fastest brain oscillations we know of, patterns associated with memory, dreaming, and conscious awareness, began rising through his cortex, as if the dying brain was not shutting down, but doing something active, something organized, something almost impossible to ignore. And that raises a question every human being eventually has to face. What actually happens in the final moments of life? Does death arrive like a switch being flipped off? Or is it something stranger than that? A transition, a cascade, a final burst of experience, a corridor rather than a wall. Tonight, we are going to follow that question as far as science can take us, into the dying brain, into near-death experiences reported by people who came back, into the mystery of DMT, the phenomenon of terminal lucidity, the ancient maps of the afterlife, the hard problem of consciousness, and the unsettling possibility that the mind may be stranger than neuroscience has yet explained. If these slow nighttime journeys into science and mystery are your kind of place, gently like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Now, let us begin with the final 30 seconds. A great deal of what we think we know about death comes from habit, not evidence. We inherit a simple image very early in life. The heart stops, the body goes still, the mind disappears. A clean ending, a sharp dividing line between being here and no longer being here. It is the version that films prefer, the version ordinary language prefers, the version the living find easiest to hold in their heads. But the biology of dying does not appear to obey that tidy picture. What we call death may not be a single instant at all. It may be a sequence, a cascade, a narrow and unstable interval in which the body is failing, yet the brain, for a brief window, is still doing something astonishingly active. That possibility came into focus because of an accident. In 2022, researchers published a report centered on an 87-year-old man who had been admitted for neurological monitoring after seizures associated with a previous brain injury. He was connected to an electroencephalogram, an EEG, a device that records the electrical rhythms of the brain in real time. The goal was not to study death. No one in that room believed they were about to capture one of the rarest kinds of data modern neuroscience could ever hope to see. Then, unexpectedly, the man suffered cardiac arrest. The recording continued. For the first time, researchers were able to examine a human brain in the seconds surrounding the moment when the heart stopped. And what they found did not look like a machine simply powering down. It looked far stranger than that. There were shifts across several frequency bands, but what drew the most attention was the activity in gamma oscillations. Gamma waves are among the fastest brain rhythms we measure. They have been associated with conscious awareness, attention, perception, memory retrieval, and states of vivid internal experience. These are not the rhythms people casually associate with absence. They are more often linked to moments when the mind is deeply engaged. That is what made the finding so unsettling. The dying brain was not producing a featureless blur of static. It was showing organized patterns of activity, including coupling between oscillations that researchers have linked in other contexts to cognition and memory processes. In plain language, the brain did not seem to be collapsing into meaningless noise. It seemed, however briefly, to be doing work. Now, caution matters here. This was one patient, one recording, one case study gathered under tragic and unplanned circumstances. No responsible scientist would claim that a single data set solves the mystery of death. It does not. But single observations can open doors, especially when they reveal something that should not, under the old assumptions, be there at all. And this was not appearing in a vacuum. Years earlier, researchers working with animal models had reported something similarly provocative. In dying rats, bursts of gamma activity had been observed after cardiac arrest, suggesting that the shutting down brain might pass through a phase of heightened electrical organization rather than immediate silence. For a long time, it remained unclear whether anything comparable might happen in humans. The 2022 report did not settle the matter, but it pushed the question out of speculation and into evidence. Then came more data. Subsequent work with patients near the end of life, including recordings gathered around the withdrawal of life support in deeply unresponsive individuals, suggested that at least some dying human brains can show surges of coherent activity concentrated in regions associated with sensory integration and conscious experience. Particularly striking was involvement of the temporal, parietal, and occipital junctions, areas that help the brain bind perception into a unified world. In some cases, connectivity appeared to reach toward frontal regions involved in higher order processing and self-related awareness. That is deeply strange, because the conventional story many people carry around is mechanical and abrupt. Once circulation fails, the brain is presumed to fall rapidly into dysfunction, and certainly it does begin to fail. Oxygen drops, metabolism falters, cells move toward crisis. None of that is in dispute, but the path from life to death may contain a brief neurological storm in which the very systems associated with memory, imagery, and awareness are activated under extreme conditions. And that leads to an uncomfortable possibility. The final moments of life may not be blank. They may be vivid. One interpretation, offered carefully by researchers and repeated cautiously in scientific discussion, is that the brain may be engaging in a form of last recall. Not necessarily a neat cinematic replay, not a literal montage arranged by some hidden editor, but a burst of coordinated neural activity drawing on memory networks at the edge of biological collapse. The machinery of selfhood may flicker intensely just before it goes out. It is easy to hear that and slide too quickly into poetry, but even stripped of all poetic language, the result remains extraordinary. The brain, under the most extreme stress it will ever face, may not immediately surrender. It may rally, it may recruit ancient survival systems, it may release inhibition, alter network balance, and briefly generate a condition unlike ordinary waking consciousness. In other words, the end may be active before it becomes silent. Dr. Sam Parnia and other researchers who study resuscitation have argued for years that death is better understood as a process than as a single point. The stopping of the heart is not identical to the irreversible end of brain function. The line between life and death, medically speaking, is more elastic than most people realize. Under some circumstances, people can be brought back after periods that older assumptions would have treated as final. That alone should make us more careful with our language. Because when we say someone is gone, what exactly do we mean? The circulation has stopped, yes. The body has entered crisis, yes. But is experience already over at that instant? Is the inner world gone in the same moment the pulse disappears? The emerging evidence suggests the answer may be more complicated. None of this proves that consciousness survives death. None of it proves an afterlife. None of it even proves that the dying brain is generating a meaningful experience in the way we usually mean experience. Scientific honesty requires restraint here. A surge in brain activity is not the same thing as a map of subjective awareness. We are still standing at the edge of inference, not certainty. But certainty has already been disturbed. The older picture, the one in which death arrives like someone turning off a light, has become much harder to defend. The data points instead toward turbulence, toward a final interval of organized neural activity, toward a brain that may remain internally engaged even as the body crosses into irreversible decline. And that changes the emotional shape of the question. Because if the brain stays active in those final seconds, then the human story of dying may be more intimate, more complex, and more mysterious than our simplest metaphors ever allowed. The last moment may not feel like nothing. It may feel like something concentrated, accelerated, and profoundly unlike ordinary time. That is where the scientific puzzle becomes personal. If the brain is capable of this kind of activity at the threshold, what is it like from the inside? Is it confusion? Is it memory? Is it a dreamlike construction assembled under biochemical stress? Is it one final effort to preserve the self? Or is it something our current models are still too primitive to name? We cannot ask the man whose brain gave us that first glimpse. He did not return to describe what he saw, if he saw anything at all. Others, however, have come closer to that boundary and made it back. And what they describe has a strange and persistent consistency that science has not been able to dismiss. Some of the most unsettling evidence in this field does not come from brain scans at all. It comes from people who were gone long enough for everyone around them to believe the story was over, and then returned with memories they should not have had. For decades, reports like these were pushed to the edges of medicine. They were treated as curious stories, emotionally powerful perhaps, but too subjective to carry much scientific weight. A patient flatlines, doctors work, circulation is restored, and afterward the patient describes unusual perceptions. A bright light, a tunnel, a strange peace, a sense of leaving the body. It was easy to file all of that away under one label: hallucination. But as resuscitation science improved, something changed. More people survived cardiac arrest. More patients could be interviewed. And the stories, instead of scattering into randomness, began to form patterns. Researchers studying awareness during resuscitation noticed that certain features appeared again and again across age groups, across medical settings, and across cultural backgrounds. Not always every feature, and not always in the same order, but often enough to make the similarities difficult to ignore. People describe seeing their own bodies from a point above or beside them, as though awareness had detached from the physical position of the brain. They described hearing voices in the room, the sound of machines, the frantic coordination of doctors and nurses. Some reported moving through darkness toward a light that did not feel harsh or blinding, but warm, intelligent, and deeply welcoming. Others described encountering deceased relatives, presences, or beings that felt more real than ordinary waking life. Many spoke of overwhelming calm, an absence of panic, a sense that whatever was happening was somehow familiar. And then there was the life review. This may be the most extraordinary element of all. Across countless reports, people do not simply remember isolated moments. They describe a panoramic return of experience, a rapid but coherent immersion in the emotional substance of their own lives. Not just what they did, but what it meant. Not just events, but consequences. In some accounts, people say they felt the effects of their actions on others, as though their own perspective had been widened or dissolved. The review is often described not as a sequence of images, but as a total knowing all at once. There is a reason these reports have held the attention of both researchers and ordinary people for so long. They do not feel to survivors like dreams. They do not feel vague. They are often described as sharper than waking consciousness, more structured than ordinary memory, and emotionally impossible to dismiss. One of the most widely discussed efforts to study this scientifically came through the AWARE studies, led by researchers including Dr. Sam Parnia. These investigations were designed to examine awareness during cardiac arrest across hospitals, rather than relying only on anecdote after the fact. The basic logic was simple. If people claim to have conscious experience during a period when the heart has stopped and measurable function is severely impaired, then those claims deserve careful, structured investigation. The findings did not deliver a neat answer. Science almost never does, but they did complicate the easy dismissal. A significant portion of survivors who could be interviewed reported some form of awareness during resuscitation. Not all described a full near-death experience. Some recalled only fragments. A sense of time passing, a feeling of being present, the impression of hearing or perceiving something while clinical efforts were underway. Others described richer experiences with recognizable recurring features, separation from the body, movement through a passage, encounters, light, peace, and life review. One case in particular became widely discussed because the patient described details from the resuscitation period that matched what medical staff reported had taken place. Cases like that are the reason this subject refuses to go away. A single story proves nothing by itself. Memory is fragile. Human beings reconstruct events. Suggestion, confusion, and the emotional force of survival can all shape recall. Serious researchers acknowledge that immediately. But once you have multiple reports gathered in clinical settings with repeating motifs and occasional details that appear externally consistent, the phenomenon becomes harder to dismiss as mere noise. That does not mean these experiences prove life after death. They do not. It means something more disciplined and in some ways more unsettling. It means that under conditions where we would expect consciousness to be absent, some patients later report experiences with structure, coherence, and durable emotional impact. That is already a scientific problem, whether the final explanation turns out to be neurological, psychological, or something stranger. There is also the after effect these experiences leave behind. People who survive cardiac arrest and report near-death experiences often say they return changed. Their fear of death is reduced, their values shift. They become less attached to status, achievement, or material success, and more focused on relationships, compassion, and meaning. Some describe a lingering grief at having come back, not because they wanted to abandon life, but because what they encountered felt profoundly peaceful, more peaceful than ordinary existence. Again, that does not prove the experience corresponded to an external reality, but it does suggest that these are not usually random scraps of mental static. They carry the psychological weight of something deeply lived. Skeptics, of course, have explanations, and some of them are persuasive. A brain in crisis is not a normal brain. Cardiac arrest cuts blood flow, oxygen drops, neurotransmitters surge, sensory systems destabilize. The visual system may narrow or distort, perhaps contributing to tunnel-like perceptions. The temporal and parietal regions may produce altered body awareness. Memory fragments may erupt under stress. Endorphins and related chemistry may contribute to calm or detachment. The brain, pushed into an extreme state, could be generating a final internally constructed experience. That is a serious explanation. It deserves respect, but it is not the same as a complete explanation. Because even if some features of the near-death experience can be modeled in terms of oxygen deprivation, disinhibition, or disturbed sensory integration, the recurring order, clarity, and emotional logic of these reports still stand out. Many survivors do not describe nonsense. They describe narratives, not always identical, but recognizably shaped, recognizably human, recognizably more organized than what people usually mean when they say hallucination. And this is why the question remains open. Are these experiences the brain's final attempt to make sense of its own collapse? A last internal world assembled under catastrophic conditions? Or are they glimpses of something that current neuroscience is not yet equipped to explain? Science has not resolved that. It has only moved us to a more honest position. We can no longer pretend there is no phenomenon here. There is. People return from the edge of death with memories that are often startlingly consistent. Some include details that make clinicians uncomfortable. Many leave behind changes in personality and worldview that last the rest of a person's life. The responsible conclusion is not certainty, it is attention. We have reports, we have patterns. We have survivors describing states of consciousness at the threshold, where consciousness should, by older assumptions, have already vanished. And that forces a harder question than the easy old debate between believers and skeptics. Not did they see heaven? Not was it all just a dream? But something narrower, more scientific, and perhaps more difficult. What kind of brain state could produce experiences like these at all? Because if the dying mind is capable of such extraordinary internal events, then the next thing we need to understand is the storm of biology that surrounds them. It is tempting to hear these accounts and jump straight to the most dramatic conclusion: a tunnel, a light, a sense of leaving the body, a life review. Surely the mind wants to say, this must be evidence that something survives. But science earns its authority precisely by slowing that impulse down. Before we decide what these experiences mean, we have to ask what a brain under extreme distress is physically capable of doing. And the answer is quite a lot. A dying brain is not a quiet organ. It is a system under catastrophic pressure, passing through one of the most violent biochemical events it will ever experience. The moment blood flow drops, the entire balance of the brain begins to change. Oxygen levels fall. Glucose delivery collapses. Cells that depend on a constant energy supply begin to fail. Pumps in neuronal membranes can no longer maintain the electrical differences that keep signaling orderly. Inhibitory control weakens. Excitatory activity can surge. Networks that are usually tightly regulated start behaving in unfamiliar ways. This is the foundation of the skeptical model. Under that model, the near-death experience does not require an afterlife. It requires a starving brain, a brain whose chemistry is unraveling in ways that can produce vivid, coherent-seeming, and emotionally overwhelming internal events. In that sense, the experience is real, but real as a product of biology rather than a window into another realm. That explanation is not shallow. In many ways, it is powerful. Consider the tunnel. One of the most famous features of near-death reports is the sensation of moving through darkness toward a distant light. This has often been compared to what happens when the visual system is disrupted. The retina and visual cortex do not fail all at once. Under loss of oxygen, the visual field can constrict. Peripheral vision may go first, leaving a central bright region surrounded by darkness. The result, from the inside, could resemble a tunnel, not a mystical passageway, but a physiological artifact of a visual system under severe metabolic stress. Then there is the feeling of peace. At first glance, that seems paradoxical. Why would a brain at the edge of death generate calm rather than terror? But the brain has ways of protecting itself from overwhelming pain and panic. Endorphins, neurotransmitters, and stress response chemistry may alter perception dramatically. Dissociation can occur. The sense of self may loosen. Fear can recede and be replaced by detachment, warmth, or acceptance. A person undergoing trauma may not feel the event the way an outside observer imagines they should. The brain does not simply report conditions, it interprets them. Sometimes it softens them. Memory fragments also make sense in a distressed brain. As energy failure spreads and inhibition breaks down, stored material may surface in unusual combinations. Images from childhood, emotionally charged memories, unresolved relationships, and deep autobiographical associations may become more available. The life review under this model is not a metaphysical judgment. It is a neurological release. The gates that usually organize and constrain memory begin to fail, and experience floods in. Time distortion fits this framework as well. The human brain does not measure time like a stopwatch. Our sense of duration is constructed. In dreams, seconds can feel like hours. In accidents, moments can stretch with impossible detail. Under extreme physiological stress, time perception can fracture completely. A brief burst of activity could be experienced subjectively as a long passage, rich with sequence and meaning, even if only a short interval has passed in the outside world. Even the out-of-body experience has neurological models behind it. The brain regions involved in body ownership and spatial self-location, especially around the temporoparietal junction, are known to produce altered bodily perception when disrupted. Electrical stimulation in some clinical contexts has triggered the sensation of floating above the body or perceiving the self from an external vantage point. The experience can feel absolute, but that does not necessarily mean awareness has literally detached from the brain. It may mean the brain's model of where the self is located has broken apart. Taken together, these ideas form a serious explanatory framework, A brain that is losing oxygen, struggling to maintain order, releasing chemicals under stress, and dropping its normal filters may generate many of the very features people later report. The tunnel, the peace, the strange clarity, the fragmentation of time, the sense of leaving the body. None of these, in isolation, require anything supernatural, and yet the skeptical model, for all its strengths, does not leave everyone satisfied. Because a good explanation should do more than explain pieces. It should explain the shape of the whole. This is where the dying brain account becomes more difficult. Near-death experiences are not usually described as random. They are not usually reported as incoherent sensory debris. Survivors often describe them as structured, ordered, meaningful. They may be bizarre, but they are rarely described as nonsense. They have narrative form. There is often a beginning, a passage, a confrontation, a review, a choice, a return. That level of organization matters. A visual distortion alone might help explain the tunnel. A surge of endorphins might help explain the calm. A release of memory fragments might help explain flashbacks from the past. But why do these elements so often seem to arrive wrapped in emotional coherence? Why do they leave such a strong impression of reality? Why do so many people insist, years later, that what they experienced was not dreamlike at all, but more real than waking life? That question has led some researchers toward the idea of disinhibition. Under ordinary conditions, the brain is not just producing consciousness, it is also limiting it. It filters, suppresses, edits, and prioritizes. Most of what your nervous system could potentially process never enters awareness. The world would be unmanageable if it did. The dying process may involve the failure of these breaks. Networks that are usually kept separate may begin cross-talking. Memory systems, sensory systems, and emotional systems may interact in ways that waking consciousness rarely permits. Instead of shutting down cleanly, the brain may pass through a brief state of radical openness. That would help explain why the content can feel amplified rather than diminished. A loss of normal filtering could generate not just confusion, but intensity. It could make internally generated experience feel vast, morally charged, and impossible to dismiss. It could also explain why survivors often come back changed. An experience does not need to reveal another world in order to permanently alter a human life. It only needs to feel final enough, deep enough, or emotionally total enough to reorder the person who lived through it. Still, one fact lingers in the background. If these experiences were only chaotic breakdown, we would expect more chaos. We would expect them to be less consistent across people, less stable in their emotional architecture, less likely to cluster around the same motifs. The dying brain model explains a great deal, but the very regularity of many reports continues to provoke debate. The chemistry is real, the oxygen loss is real, the neural instability is real, but whether those mechanisms fully account for the richness of what people describe remains uncertain. This is where science is most honest when it is least theatrical. It can say that the dying brain undergoes extraordinary physiological stress. It can say that altered chemistry and collapsing network control are capable of producing profound changes in experience. It can say that many features of near-death reports are at least partly compatible with known brain mechanisms. What it cannot yet say is that the case is closed, because even inside the skeptical framework, another question begins to emerge. If the brain under mortal stress can generate a state this intense, this immersive, and this strangely patterned, then what molecular tools is it using? What chemistry is involved when the mind moves into territory so unlike ordinary waking life? That is where one particular molecule enters the story, and it has haunted the edge of this debate for years. There is a molecule that keeps appearing at the edge of this conversation, like a rumor science cannot quite get rid of. It is tiny, it acts fast, and when people encounter it in concentrated form, they often describe experiences that sound unnervingly familiar. They speak of leaving the ordinary world behind in seconds, of ego dissolving, of tunnels, radiant light, impossible landscapes, presences that feel intelligent, and a sense that what they are entering is not fantasy but reality at a higher resolution. Many say the experience is not merely strange, it is overwhelming, sacred, and absolute. That molecule is DMT. Dimethyltryptamine has been called one of the most powerful psychedelics known to science. In recreational culture, it has acquired almost mythic status. But the reason it matters here is not because it produces bizarre visions. Many compounds do that. DMT matters because the subjective structure of the experience often overlaps with the structure of near-death reports in ways that are difficult to ignore. People given DMT frequently describe a rapid loss of ordinary selfhood. The I that usually feels stable and continuous begins to come apart. Boundaries soften. The world of everyday objects disappears. Time changes shape. Some report moving through a passage or being pulled through a kind of corridor of motion and light. Many describe entities or presences. Others report a sense of vast intelligence, unconditional love, or knowledge too large to fit into language. Some say it felt as though they had died. Others say it felt more like remembering a place they had somehow known all along. That resemblance has fascinated researchers for decades. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Rick Strassman conducted highly influential human studies with DMT in the United States. Volunteers were given the compound under controlled conditions, and their reports sounded less like ordinary drug intoxication and more like an abrupt relocation into another mode of being. The experiences were often short in clock time, but immense in subjective depth. Strassman later became widely associated with the idea that DMT might have some relationship to birth, dreaming, and death. At the time, that idea was provocative but speculative. The older version of the story focused heavily on the pineal gland, the small structure deep in the brain, long surrounded by philosophical and mystical symbolism. René Descartes had once called it the seat of the soul. That kind of historical language made the theory irresistible to popular imagination. But mainstream science remained cautious, and rightly so. Symbolism is not evidence. The pineal gland already has a known job in regulating melatonin and circadian rhythms. Claiming it also manufactures the chemistry of transcendence required more than poetic association. For years, the criticism was simple. Where is the data? Then the data started to become more interesting. Researchers began finding evidence that DMT is not only an external psychedelic humans can consume, but an endogenous molecule, something the body can produce on its own. Key enzymes involved in DMT synthesis were found expressed in mammalian brain tissue. That mattered because it moved the idea out of metaphor and into biochemistry. The brain was not merely capable of responding to DMT. It appeared capable, under at least some conditions, of making it. This is where the story became difficult to dismiss. In animal research, scientists measured DMT in the brains of rats and found it present at levels that were not merely trivial trace contamination. Even more provocative, during experimentally induced cardiac arrest, DMT levels rose. The dying brain, at least in these animal models, did not simply shut down chemically. It changed state. One of the compounds implicated in altered experience increased during the very kind of crisis that defines the border of death. That does not prove DMT explains near-death experiences, but it does transform the question. No longer are we asking whether DMT is some exotic outside substance that happens to resemble reports from people who nearly died. We are asking whether the brain itself may participate in producing a chemistry of radical altered consciousness under extreme conditions. That is a very different conversation. Another important piece came from direct comparison studies. In controlled research, participants given DMT completed near-death experience scales, and the overlap was striking. Not perfect, not one-to-one, but striking. Ego dissolution, encounters with beings, intense light, transcendence, peace, boundary crossing, and the sense of entering a domain more real than ordinary life showed up with enough consistency to make the resemblance more than casual. This is why DMT is so difficult to place neatly in the story. For some people, it looks like a debunking tool. Near-death experiences feel profound because the brain has chemistry capable of generating exactly that kind of event. There is no need to invoke survival, soul, or afterlife. The experience may simply be a powerful internal state. For others, the same data cuts the other way. If the brain naturally releases a molecule that opens consciousness into an experience nearly identical to what people report at the edge of death, perhaps that chemistry is not refuting transcendence but mediating it. In this view, DMT is not the fake version of the experience. It is the doorway mechanism. Science, at least honest science, has not earned the right to choose between those interpretations yet. There are serious limitations. One of the strongest criticisms is quantitative. Even if the brain can produce DMT, can it produce enough in the right regions, at the right moment, to account for the full force of a near-death experience in humans? DMT is also broken down rapidly in the body. Its presence alone does not settle the issue. Chemistry is not meaning. A molecule can correlate with an experience without fully explaining its structure, its emotional logic, or its long-term impact. There is also the problem of reduction. Even if DMT contributes to the experience, does that actually explain anything away? Saying the brain used DMT may be no more satisfying in the end than saying the brain used electrical activity. Of course it used chemistry. Every conscious state is entangled with chemistry. Love has chemistry. Grief has chemistry. Memory has chemistry. The existence of a molecular pathway does not automatically strip an experience of significance. And there is an intriguing wrinkle beyond altered perception itself. Some researchers have suggested that DMT may interact with systems involved not only in subjective experience, but in neuroprotection and stress response. If that turns out to be true, then the molecule's role may not be simply to generate visions. It may be part of a broader emergency physiology, a compound released in moments of crisis that both alters consciousness and helps the brain endure extreme conditions. That possibility is still being worked out, but it adds another layer. The chemistry of dying may not be random. It may be adaptive, ancient, and biologically meaningful, which leaves us in a familiar place. DMT may be part of the answer without being the whole answer. It may help explain why the dying mind can become immersive, luminous, and radically unlike ordinary waking life. It may help account for the emotional force and altered geometry of near-death reports. It may even represent one of the brain's own tools for crossing into a final state of extraordinary consciousness. But it does not close the case, because even if the chemistry is real, another difficulty remains. There are moments near death that do not merely look like altered consciousness. They look like the return of consciousness where it should no longer be available at all. There are stories that unsettle neuroscientists for a very different reason. They are not stories of strange visions, altered colors, or tunnels of light. They are stories of return, not return from death itself, but return from mental disappearance, return from silence, return from a mind that, by every ordinary expectation, should no longer be able to come back. Imagine a person in the final stage of Alzheimer's disease, a person who has not recognized family members in years, a person who cannot form clear sentences, cannot reliably identify where they are, cannot hold on to the thread of a conversation. The disease has stripped away memory, language, orientation, and much of what loved ones once knew as the person inside. Then, sometime in the last day of life, that person wakes up. The eyes focus, the confusion lifts. They say a child's name. They recognize a spouse. They ask a coherent question. They recall a detail from long ago. For an hour, or 10 minutes, or sometimes only a few breaths, they are unmistakably themselves again. And then they die. This phenomenon has a name: terminal lucidity. It sounds almost literary, as though it belongs in a Victorian novel or a hospice legend passed from nurse to nurse. it has been described in medical literature, in caregiver reports, and in observational studies with enough frequency that it can no longer be dismissed as a charming myth. Something real is happening here. The difficulty is that no one fully understands what. That is why terminal lucidity disturbs the standard picture of mind and brain so deeply. The prevailing model in neuroscience is not unreasonable. Memories, personality, language, and selfhood are associated with physical brain structures and physical brain networks. Damage those structures and the functions degrade. Destroy enough of them, and they do not simply become inaccessible. They are presumed to be gone. Alzheimer's disease is not a mild interruption. It is a progressive neurodegenerative assault. Amyloid plaques accumulate. Tau pathology spreads. Synapses fail. Neurons die. The hippocampus, so critical for memory, shrinks. The cortex thins. Networks that once carried a lifetime of identity are progressively dismantled. Under that framework, advanced dementia should move in one direction. Downward, not upward. Certainly not upward in the final hours, when the body itself is failing. And yet, families, nurses, palliative care clinicians, and researchers keep documenting moments that do not fit the script. A patient who had been largely nonverbal suddenly speaks with clarity. Someone who had not recognized loved ones in years suddenly names them one by one. A person who seemed absent suddenly expresses affection, says goodbye, or delivers a brief but coherent final conversation. These episodes vary in length and intensity. Sometimes they are dramatic, sometimes they are subtle, just a sudden look of recognition or a few words spoken with unmistakable intent. But what makes them powerful is not only that they happen, it is that the people who witness them almost never doubt what they saw. They do not usually say, "There was a small improvement." They say, "For a moment, she was back." That language matters. It reflects the sense caregivers often report that the lucid interval is not random movement or reflexive speech. It feels personal, directed, as if the missing person inside the damaged brain briefly reappeared before vanishing for good. Researchers such as Bruce Grayson and colleagues helped bring more formal attention to this phenomenon, and more recent surveys of healthcare workers suggest it is not especially rare in end-of-life care. Many palliative and hospice professionals report having witnessed at least one episode during their careers. That alone makes it difficult to dismiss as mere folklore. If enough trained observers across settings continue describing the same basic event, science has an obligation to take the event seriously even before it can explain it. Still, taking it seriously is not the same as surrendering to mystery. There are hypotheses, and some of them are plausible. One idea is that not all damaged networks are equally destroyed. Even in severe dementia, there may remain islands of function, dormant pathways, or silent synaptic routes that are usually unavailable, but can, under rare conditions, become briefly integrated. A failing brain may not be a uniformly dead landscape, it may be a fragmented one. Under unusual physiological conditions, fragments may align just long enough to restore something like coherence. Another proposal involves disinhibition, a theme that has already appeared in our exploration of the dying brain. The brain is not only a producer of mental states, it is also a regulator. It suppresses, filters, gates, and constrains. If the dying process weakens certain inhibitory systems, functions that were previously blocked or buried might, for a short time, become accessible. In this view, the disease did not erase everything. It trapped access to what remained, and the dying process briefly loosened the lock. There are also more speculative network explanations. Some researchers have suggested that metabolic changes, fluctuations in toxic burden, or transient shifts in connectivity could create short windows of restored integration. The brain may, in its final crisis, reorganize in a way that momentarily stabilizes certain functions before global failure continues. These hypotheses are not absurd. They are attempts to keep the phenomenon inside neuroscience, where most scientists understandably want it to remain. And perhaps one day, with enough prospective monitoring, EEG recordings, and careful observation, a mechanistic explanation will become clearer. But at present, the fit is not clean. That is the problem. Terminal lucidity does not just ask how a damaged brain might still produce some activity. It asks how a brain that seems to have lost the architecture of self can suddenly produce the signature of selfhood with such precision, recognition, language, relationship, memory, emotional presence. These are not trivial functions. They are among the most complex things the brain does. When they reappear near death, the event lands with a philosophical force that goes well beyond medicine. Because beneath the clinical question lies a more disturbing one. If the structures appear too damaged to support the person we thought was gone, what exactly is coming back? The conventional answer is still the safest one. Some function remained, and the dying process temporarily unlocked it. That may well be true, but it is not the only frame people reach for when they see these events with their own eyes. For many families, terminal lucidity feels less like a mechanical fluctuation and more like an unveiling, as though the disease had been obscuring the person rather than destroying them completely, as though the mind had been pressed behind damaged circuitry and was, for one last interval, able to come through. That way of speaking makes many scientists uncomfortable, and understandably so. It edges toward metaphysics. It invites ideas that neuroscience cannot currently test. But discomfort is not refutation. The fact remains that terminal lucidity exerts pressure on a purely simplistic model in which mind is nothing more than whatever the visible damage seems to permit at a given moment. At minimum, it tells us our map is incomplete. It may tell us that degenerating brains are more dynamic than we thought, or that access to memory and selfhood is more complicated than structural scans alone suggest, or that consciousness is not exhausted by the easiest version of material explanation. And that is what makes terminal lucidity so haunting. It appears at the edge of death, but it does not behave like simple disappearance. It behaves like a brief return of order, a final reappearance of personhood, a last clear window before the body closes for good. But whatever we think is happening in the mind, another reality remains. The body is still dying. The organs are still failing. Chemistry is still moving forward with absolute indifference to mystery. To understand death fully, we cannot stay only with consciousness. We also have to look at what the body does when the person seems to leave it behind. However strange the mind may become near death, the body tells its own story. It is a quieter story, less mystical, less dramatic in the way people usually imagine drama. But in some ways, it is just as profound. Because whatever anyone believes about the soul, consciousness, or the possibility of something beyond the brain, the body does not vanish when the heart stops. It begins to change, slowly at first, then all at once. The first thing to understand is that biological death is not a single switch. The heart can stop before every cell has died. The brain can enter crisis before every tissue has failed. Different systems shut down on different schedules. What the living call death is often a legal or clinical threshold, but the body itself follows a timetable of its own. It moves in stages. Chemistry continues. Gravity continues. Heat continues to leave. Within minutes, circulation is gone. Blood is no longer being pushed through the vast branching network of vessels that kept every organ supplied. Oxygen delivery halts. Cells that depend on a constant stream of energy begin to struggle immediately. The skin often loses some of its color as surface circulation disappears. Warmth starts to drain away. The body begins moving toward the temperature of the room around it. This is one of the first strange truths of death. The body starts returning to the environment almost immediately. Without blood pressure to hold it in motion, blood settles downward under gravity. Without fresh oxygen and glucose, cells lose the ability to maintain the delicate balance that defines living tissue. Muscles, which in life depend on stored chemical energy to tighten and release, begin to behave differently as that energy disappears. Over time, they stiffen. Later, as breakdown continues, that stiffness fades again. Nothing about this is theatrical. It is biological, patient, exact. And then the deeper chemistry begins. In life, the body is full of systems designed to build, repair, digest, regulate, and defend. But those same systems depend on containment. Cells keep enzymes in the places where those enzymes belong. Membranes separate one chemical world from another. The immune system keeps bacteria in their lanes. Death does not invent a new body. It removes the discipline that held the living one together. As that discipline fails, cells begin to break down from within. Membranes lose integrity. Enzymes leak into surrounding tissues. Organs that were once carefully maintained start to digest themselves at the microscopic level. The pancreas, loaded with powerful digestive enzymes, is often among the first to undergo rapid self-breakdown. The brain, rich in water and delicate structure, is especially vulnerable. The intestines, already crowded with trillions of bacteria that were useful in life, become the starting point for a different kind of process once immune control is gone. That process sounds grim when described clinically, but it is also strangely beautiful in its logic. Life depends on boundaries. Death is what happens when those boundaries are released. The bacteria that help sustain you in life do not suddenly become evil. They simply continue being what they always were, living organisms responding to conditions. The body that once maintained them as partners can no longer do so. Chemistry spreads, tissue softens, complex structures become simpler ones. The body returns, molecule by molecule, to the wider cycles that were always waiting. This is why it can be misleading to think of the body as something that simply stops. A body after death is not an engine that has gone dark. It is a system-changing state. The order that held trillions of cells in a coordinated human pattern begins to loosen. The body is no longer a self-maintaining whole. It is becoming matter again. Not meaningless matter, not discarded matter, just matter no longer arranged around a living center. And that distinction matters, because people often imagine decay only as loss when it is also redistribution. The carbon in your tissues does not disappear. The water in your cells does not disappear. The minerals in your bones do not disappear. They move. They are released back into the world that loaned them to you in the first place. In a buried body, this happens through soil, microbes, moisture, roots, and time. In cremation, it happens more quickly through heat and atmosphere. In every case, the same principle remains. The material that held a human life does not cease to exist. It changes form and enters other systems. That is not a metaphor. It is literally how the earth works. This is why some scientists, especially those who study ecology and decomposition, describe death not only as ending, but as transfer. A human body can enrich soil. It can alter microbial activity in the immediate environment. It can, in a very real sense, feed future growth. Under the right conditions, what was once a person becomes part of grasses, trees, insects, water, air, and the layered chemistry of the living world. The emotional difficulty, of course, is that this does not preserve the person in the way grief longs for. No one mourns the atoms themselves. They mourn the pattern, the voice, the memories, the expression on a familiar face, the way one specific life held itself together for a while and called itself me. Biology can describe where the matter goes. It does not answer by itself what happens to the experience that once moved through that matter. But the body still has something important to teach. It teaches that death is not a magical disappearance. It is a return, not necessarily a return of consciousness, not necessarily a return of identity, but a return of substance. The body goes back to the same universe that built it. The same chemical rules apply after death as before it. The same earth receives what the body can no longer keep. And if that sounds cold, it only sounds cold because we are used to hearing it without wonder. The truth is more tender than it first appears. You are not outside nature for one moment of your life, and you are not outside it for one moment after. The body that carried you was assembled from the world and will go back into the world. Heat leaves, blood settles, cells fail, muscles stiffen, boundaries dissolve. The body returns to biology. That is not all there is to the mystery of death. But it is part of the mystery, and it is real. Long before EEG recordings, hospital monitors, and modern debates about consciousness, human beings were already trying to solve the same problem. What happens when the body goes still, but the question does not? Every civilization that became sophisticated enough to bury its dead also became sophisticated enough to imagine a destination. Not always the same destination, not always the same rules, but again and again, across geography and language and centuries of separation, people built maps for what comes after the final breath. And those maps, despite all their differences, begin to rhyme. Ancient Egypt may be the clearest place to start because no culture in history devoted more imagination, wealth, or precision to death than the Egyptians. For them, dying was not a symbolic idea. It was a journey, literal and dangerous, requiring preparation. Tombs were not merely graves, they were launch systems. Bodies were preserved because the self, in Egyptian thought, was not a simple unit that vanished cleanly at death. A human being was made of multiple aspects, and death separated them. The Ka was the life force, the vital energy that distinguished the living from the dead. The Bia was closer to personality, the mobile and individual spirit often depicted as a human-headed bird capable of traveling between worlds. And if things went well after death, if the proper conditions were met and the trials were passed, these aspects could be reunited into the Akh, a transformed and luminous being fit for eternity. That transformation did not happen automatically. Between death and the hoped-for paradise stood the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. And the Duat was not gentle. It was described as a place of gates, rivers, caverns, guardians, fire, monsters, and tests. The dead needed knowledge. They needed names, formulas, prayers, passwords. This is why what we now call the Book of the Dead mattered so much. It was not one single book in the modern sense, but a collection of spells and instructions meant to guide the deceased through the hazards ahead. At the center of this tradition was one image that has survived for thousands of years because it still lands with unsettling force: the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Ma'at, before Osiris and a company of divine judges, the heart of the dead was placed on one side of a scale. On the other side was the feather of truth. The heart, in Egyptian thought, was not just an organ, it was the record of a life. If it balanced lightly enough, the person moved on to the field of reeds, an idealized continuation of earthly life in perfected form. If it did not, the heart was devoured and the self was undone. What makes this image so powerful is not only its drama, it is its structure. A life is reviewed, actions matter, there is a reckoning. The self does not simply disappear into neutral darkness, it is measured. That pattern should sound familiar by now. Many modern near-death reports include something astonishingly close to a moral review. People describe not merely remembering what they did, but reliving the emotional consequences of what they did to others. They speak of kindness and cruelty becoming vivid all at once. The language is modern, the brain scans are modern, but the architecture is ancient. A life is placed somehow before itself. If Egypt gave the afterlife the shape of a perilous journey through an external underworld, Tibetan Buddhism gave it the shape of consciousness meeting itself. The Bardo Thodol, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead in the West, offers one of the most psychologically sophisticated maps of dying ever produced. In this tradition, the period after death is not mainly about gates, monsters, and geography. It is about mind. The body falls away, but awareness continues through intermediate states known as bardos. The dying person is guided, sometimes literally by being read to, through these states so that they might recognize what is happening and, if possible, become liberated. The sequence begins with dissolution. The elements of the body are said to break down in stages. Sensory experience changes. Identity loosens. The familiar structure of being a person, begins to come apart. Then comes one of the central ideas in Tibetan death literature, the appearance of the clear light. This light is not described merely as a visual phenomenon. It is the unveiled nature of mind itself, pure awareness without the usual boundaries, habits, and attachments. If the dying consciousness recognizes it, liberation is possible. If it recoils, confusion follows. Visions then emerge, peaceful deities, wrathful deities, lights, sounds, frightening or magnificent forms. But the crucial teaching is that these are not separate gods in the usual sense. They are projections of consciousness, mind encountering its own contents at full intensity. That is a radically different model from Egypt, yet listen closely enough and the overlap becomes hard to miss. There is dissolution of the ordinary self. There is light. There is encounter. There is a test, not necessarily by an external judge, but by one's own capacity to recognize what is real. There is more than one possible outcome: liberation, return, confusion, continuation. Again, the same architecture. Then there are the traditions of Greece and the Norse world, each different in tone, but still built around familiar elements. In the Greek imagination, death led downward into the realm of Hades. The dead crossed a boundary river with the help of Charon, the ferryman, and were sorted into different conditions of afterlife. There was the asphodel meadows for the ordinary dead, Elysium for the heroic or blessed, Tartarus for punishment. The details varied over time, but the pattern remained: crossing, guide, evaluation, destination. The Norse afterlife was shaped by an entirely different moral and cultural world. Valhalla was not a place of stillness, but of preparation, feasting, and battle. Warriors chosen by the Valkyries were brought there to train for Ragnarok, the final cosmic struggle. Others went elsewhere, including Hell, a colder and dimmer realm. The Norse system was less centered on moral accounting in the Egyptian or later Abrahamic sense, but it still revolved around passage, escort, and differentiated destinations. The dead did not simply vanish. They were sorted into meaning. If you widen the lens further, the repetition becomes even more striking: a crossing, a guide, a judgment, review, or sorting. More than one destination. These motifs appear over and over again across civilizations that never met one another. Egypt had Anubis. Greece had Hermes and Charon. The Norse had Valkyries. Tibet had teachers guiding consciousness through the bardos. Different names, different symbols, same basic design. So what are we looking at? One possibility is the most conservative one. Human beings everywhere share the same nervous system. If dying brains tend to generate certain classes of experience, passages, lights, presences, life review, altered selfhood, then cultures may simply encode those universal events in local language and mythic imagery. The Egyptians see scales and underworld gates. Tibetans see clear light and wrathful deities. Greeks see rivers and judges. The brain event is the same. The symbolic clothing changes. That explanation has real force, but it is not the only one people have proposed. Another possibility is that these traditions preserve recurring contact with something genuine, not identical in all details, but similar enough that humans across time keep circling the same structure, because the structure is there to be encountered. Science cannot currently prove either view. What it can say is that the convergence itself is real. The living keep describing death as movement rather than erasure, as passage rather than interruption, as encounter rather than blankness, as something in which how a life was lived continues to matter. That should make us cautious before dismissing ancient death literature as childish superstition. These traditions were not primitive in the way modern arrogance sometimes assumes. They were attempts, often disciplined, elaborate, and psychologically acute, to map the most universal threshold any human being will ever face. And once you notice how consistently these cultures keep seeing the same broad pattern, another question starts to press forward. Why do they keep seeing the same shape at all? Patterns this persistent are difficult to laugh off. The Egyptians had never heard of Tibetan Buddhism. The Norse did not borrow their vision of death from the Greeks in any simple way. Civilizations separated by mountains, deserts, oceans, and centuries kept arriving at strangely similar blueprints. Not the same names, not the same costumes, but the same underlying architecture. A passage, a guide, a reckoning. More than one possible destination. That alone does not prove anything supernatural. Human beings also independently invented boats, drums, and burial rituals. Similar minds facing similar problems often generate similar structures. But the afterlife pattern is so specific and so emotionally consistent that it deserves a closer look. One of the most repeated elements is movement through a boundary. Sometimes it is a river, sometimes a tunnel, sometimes a bridge, a gate, a road, a descent, or a corridor of light. The image changes, but the function remains the same. Death is rarely imagined as a static stop. It is imagined as transit, a crossing from one condition into another. Even in modern near-death reports, that structure appears with remarkable force. People describe traveling through darkness, moving toward brightness, approaching an edge, a line, or a threshold beyond which return is no longer possible. Then there is the guide. Again, the details shift, but the role does not. Anubis in Egypt, Charon in Greece, Valkyries in the Norse world, angels in Abrahamic traditions. Teachers are voices in Tibetan practice, presences, beings, relatives, figures of light in modern near-death reports. The mind at the edge of death seems almost universally to refuse the image of going alone. Someone meets you, someone escorts you, someone interprets the terrain. That could be theology. It could also be psychology. Human beings are social creatures so deeply shaped by attachment that even our fear of annihilation may be structured in relational terms. If the dying brain generates immersive internal experience, perhaps it does so in the language it knows best: encounter, recognition, accompaniment. A guide makes emotional sense. The unknown becomes bearable if it has a face. But the pattern does not stop there. The third motif is moral evaluation. This may be the most striking one. Across cultures, death is very often not merely an event. It is an accounting. Hearts are weighed, deeds are reviewed, bridges are crossed according to merit, souls are judged, karma ripens. In modern near-death literature, this often appears as the life review, where people say they do not simply remember what they did, but feel the consequences of it, sometimes from the perspective of those they affected. That is a very specific shape for the imagination to keep producing. It suggests that the human mind, when confronting death, does not only ask, "What happens to me?" It asks, "What did my life mean?" The review is not just about survival. It is about value, about whether kindness mattered, whether cruelty mattered, whether a life can be measured by more than the fact that it occurred. Even the destinations tend to repeat their logic: paradise and punishment, dissolution and continuation, liberation and return, Valhalla and hell, Elysium and Tartarus, the field of reeds and annihilation, heaven, hell, rebirth, the clear light, the river, the gate. Different mythologies produce different scenery, but they often preserve the same basic branching structure. Death leads somewhere, and where it leads depends on something: character, knowledge, courage, karma, faith, or recognition. So, why does this keep happening? There are, broadly speaking, two ways to read it. The first is neurological. Under this view, dying human brains tend to produce a consistent family of experiences because human nervous systems are built on the same general template. The visual system under stress may generate passage-like imagery. Altered body perception may produce floating or separation from the body. Disinhibition and memory release may create a life review. Emotional and social circuitry may populate the experience with beings, guides, and loved ones. A sense of judgment may emerge because the collapsing mind, flooded with autobiographical and emotional content, organizes the final experience around meaning and self-evaluation. If that model is correct, then afterlife traditions are not random myths. They are cultural translations of the same biological event. Egypt translates it into scales and the feather of Ma'at. Tibet translates it into clear light and bardos. Christianity translates it into judgment and resurrection. Modern secular people translate it into near-death experiences and neuroscience. Same nervous system, different storytelling language. That explanation is elegant because it preserves both seriousness and restraint. It does not mock the traditions. It treats them as interpretations of something real that happens to human beings, even if the reality is internal rather than metaphysical. But the second reading refuses to stop there. Perhaps these cultures are not merely projecting the same brain event. Perhaps they are repeatedly contacting the same underlying structure of reality, filtered through different beliefs, symbols, and expectations. Under that view, the tunnel is not just a visual artifact. The guide is not just attachment circuitry. The life review is not just autobiographical memory breaking loose. These are distorted but genuine glimpses of something that exists independently of the brain, something people across history keep trying and failing to describe in human terms. Science cannot currently prove that. But science also cannot fully dissolve the convergence by pointing at one mechanism and declaring the matter finished. The dying brain model explains much, but not everything. Culture explains variation, but not the recurrence of core motifs with such stubborn regularity. And even if all of it turns out to be internal, the question would remain, why is the human brain built to meet death in this particular shape? Why a passage? Why a guide? Why a reckoning? Why does the edge of existence so often organize itself as a journey with meaning rather than a collapse into chaos? That is where the mystery deepens. Because once enough cultures, enough testimonies, and enough modern case reports begin echoing one another, the conversation shifts. We are no longer asking whether human beings tell stories about death. Of course they do. We are asking why those stories keep circling the same structure, and whether that structure comes from the architecture of the brain, the architecture of reality, or some combination of both. That question leads directly into an even more uncomfortable one. If the same shapes keep appearing at the edge of death, maybe the real problem is not death at all. Maybe the real problem is consciousness. There is a point where every discussion about death runs into a deeper problem. Not the problem of religion, not the problem of mythology, not even the problem of whether near-death experiences are real, imagined, or something in between. The deeper problem is consciousness itself. Because before we can answer what death does to consciousness, we would have to answer a far more basic question: what consciousness is in the first place. And that is exactly where modern science, for all its power, becomes strangely uncertain. A philosopher named David Chalmers gave this uncertainty a name in the 1990s. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. The phrase has lasted because it points to something almost embarrassingly obvious and yet still unsolved. Your brain is doing something right now. Neurons are firing, signals are moving, sensory information is being processed. Memory, attention, language, prediction, emotion, all of it is unfolding through electrochemical activity inside a living organ. Science can describe more and more of that activity with astonishing precision. We can see which regions become active when you look at a face, hear music, remember a childhood room, or feel fear. We can trace pathways. We can study networks. We can damage one area and observe which ability disappears. We can alter chemistry and watch consciousness shift. That is extraordinary progress. But none of it answers the central mystery. Why does any of this feel like anything from the inside? Why is there an experience of being you? When light reaches the eye, it is converted into electrical signals. Those signals travel through the visual system and are processed in layers of increasing complexity. Edges, motion, color, depth. We can describe that chain in remarkable detail. But nowhere in the description do we find the redness of red. Nowhere do we find the actual felt quality of seeing. The mechanism can be mapped. The experience remains unexplained. That gap is the hard problem. Chalmers distinguished it from what he called the the easy problems of consciousness. The phrase is slightly misleading because those problems are not easy in the everyday sense. They are enormously difficult, but they are easier in principle because they concern function. How does the brain integrate information? How does it guide attention? How does it control behavior? How does it store memory? These are engineering questions, even if they are staggeringly complex ones. The hard problem is different. It asks why all that function is accompanied by subjective life at all, why there is a first-person point of view, why the universe, in at least one corner of itself, is not just processing information, but experiencing it. This sounds abstract until you realize how close it cuts to our topic. If science has not yet explained how consciousness arises during life, then any absolute confidence about what happens to consciousness in death is already built on incomplete ground. The dominant view in neuroscience is still materialist, and for good reason. Damage the brain and the mind changes. Alter neurochemistry and experience changes. Destroy specific regions and specific capacities disappear. Injury can reshape personality. Disease can erase memory. Anesthesia can turn consciousness off and then allow it to return. The evidence that mind is deeply tied to brain is overwhelming. No serious person should deny that. If the hippocampus is damaged, memory suffers. If language areas are injured, speech can fail. If the visual cortex is impaired, vision changes. If certain drugs alter signaling, thought and perception shift dramatically. The correlations are not subtle. They are everywhere. This is why most scientists assume that consciousness is produced by the brain, in the same broad sense that digestion is produced by the stomach, or contraction is produced by muscle. That model is powerful, but it is not complete. Correlation is not the same thing as mechanism. We know that brain states and conscious states travel together. We do not yet know why physical processes should generate a felt inner world in the first place. The machinery is visible. The experience is not. There is an explanatory gap between the two, and that gap has not closed. This is where some thinkers introduce the idea of the philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie is a hypothetical being physically identical to a human in every outward respect. It talks, reacts, smiles, remembers, says, "I am in pain," and behaves exactly as a conscious person would. But inwardly, there is no experience at all, no awareness, no felt life, no one home. Most people find the idea disturbing, and that is the point. If you can coherently imagine a creature that performs all the functions of consciousness without actually experiencing anything, then function alone may not explain consciousness. Something more remains unaccounted for. Now, many scientists dislike that thought experiment, and not without reason. Some argue that if a system behaves in every way as though it is conscious, then positing the absence of consciousness adds nothing useful. But even critics of the zombie argument still face the underlying difficulty. Why do certain arrangements of matter produce subjectivity rather than mere function? Why should the universe contain an interior view at all? No one knows. And because no one knows, the science of death has to proceed with a certain humility. This does not mean we should abandon material explanations. It means we should be honest about their limits. To say that the brain generates consciousness may be correct. It may even turn out to be the only correct framework. But at present, that statement is still more secure as a working assumption than as a fully explained fact. That distinction matters. Because many debates about death are too quick on both sides, some people leap from mystery straight into certainty about souls, afterlives, or cosmic consciousness. Others leap from brain correlation straight into certainty that death must be annihilation. Both moves outrun what we actually know. What we know is that consciousness depends on the brain in ways that are intimate and undeniable. What we do not know is why that dependence exists in the form it does, or whether the brain is best understood as a generator, a filter, an organizer, or something for which our current language is still too crude. That is why the hard problem becomes impossible to ignore once we reach the threshold of death. If consciousness were already fully explained as a product of neural computation, then the death question would feel easier. The machinery breaks, the process ends. Case closed. But consciousness has not been explained that way. Not fully, not mechanistically. We have maps of correlation. We do not yet have an answer to why subjective experience exists at all. And this is exactly where the anomalies start to matter more. Near-death experiences matter more. Terminal lucidity matters more. The recurring structure of afterlife reports matters more. None of these phenomena prove that consciousness can exist independently of the brain, but they press against the edges of a framework that is still unfinished. They remind us that the mind is not yet a solved problem, and if the mind is not solved, then death cannot be solved by simple confidence either. The strangest part may be this. We know more about distant galaxies, black holes, and the early universe than we do about the fact that experience is happening right now behind your eyes as you hear these words. That is not poetry. It is a scientific embarrassment and a profound one. The hard problem does not tell us that consciousness survives death. It does something subtler. It removes the false comfort of premature certainty. It tells us that before we decide whether death is a wall, a door, or something stranger, we first have to admit that the thing approaching that wall, the conscious self, is still not understood. And once that is admitted, another possibility begins to enter the room. Maybe the brain is not only producing the signal, maybe it is also receiving, shaping, narrowing, or tuning it. There is a metaphor that refuses to die because it is so simple, and simplicity is comforting. The brain is a machine. Consciousness is what the machine produces. Damage the machine, and the product changes. Destroy the machine, and the product ends. That model has enormous power behind it. It explains why strokes alter language, why tumors can change personality, why anesthesia can erase awareness for a time, and why degenerative disease can slowly dismantle memory and identity. It is not foolish. It is not primitive. It is the dominant view in neuroscience for a reason. And yet there are moments when it begins to feel less complete than we would like. Not false, just incomplete. That is when another possibility enters the room, one that has existed for more than a century and keeps returning whenever the standard picture develops cracks. The possibility is that the brain does not only generate consciousness, it may also shape it, limit it, or receive it in ways we do not yet fully understand. The simplest version of the contrast looks like this. Under the generator model, the brain creates mind the way a furnace creates heat. No furnace, no heat. Consciousness is an emergent product of neural activity. The circuits fire in the right way, and experience appears. The circuits fail, and experience disappears. Under the receiver or filter model, the brain is less like a furnace and more like an instrument. A radio does not create the music in the broadcast tower. A prism does not create light. It shapes what passes through it. In this view, the brain may still be absolutely necessary for ordinary human consciousness as we know it, but its role is not purely generative. It may be organizing, translating, narrowing, or tuning something more fundamental. Most mainstream scientists remain with the first model, and that makes sense. It is the model most tightly supported by everyday evidence. Brain states and mental states move together too reliably to ignore, but certain anomalies keep pressing on the edges of the picture, and once enough of them accumulate, they force the question back onto the table. Terminal lucidity is one of those anomalies. A person with severe dementia, whose brain shows profound structural damage and who has been absent in the deepest practical sense, suddenly returns to coherence. They recognize family, they speak clearly, they seem present. Then the clarity vanishes with death. If consciousness is wholly and straightforwardly generated by neural hardware, the event is difficult to fit into a simple one-way model of decline. There may be ways to explain it inside material neuroscience, and researchers are trying, but the phenomenon still exerts pressure. It suggests that the visible damage and the apparent disappearance of self may not line up as neatly as we once assumed. Near-death experiences apply a different kind of pressure. If people later describe structured awareness during periods when the brain should have been severely compromised, then either the brain is capable of producing astonishingly organized experience in extremis, or our assumptions about when experience becomes impossible are less secure than we thought. Again, that does not prove the receiver model. It does something subtler. It prevents the generator model from feeling as closed and finished as its strongest defenders sometimes imply. This is where the older metaphors become useful. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, entertained the idea that the brain might act less as a creator of consciousness than as a transmission system. He suggested that the brain could be more like a reducing mechanism, a structure that channels and limits a wider field of awareness into the narrow stream necessary for ordinary human life. Later, Aldous Huxley expanded that intuition into the image of the brain as a reducing valve. The world, on this account, may contain more consciousness, more information, more possible experience than a biological organism can safely handle. The brain filters most of it out. It protects us from the flood. It is a strange idea, but it has survived because it maps so neatly onto certain experiences. Psychedelics, meditation, trauma, dreams, and near-death states often feel not like ordinary thought intensified, but like the breakdown of boundaries. The self loosens, the world widens, the filters seem to weaken. Whether that means access to something beyond the brain, or simply a different internal configuration of the brain, is exactly what remains contested. The prism metaphor works in a slightly different way. White light passes through glass and becomes many colors. Break the prism and the colors vanish, but not because light itself has been annihilated. The shaping device is what made that particular expression visible. Applied to consciousness, the image suggests that the personal self may be what happens when a broader field is focused through one biological life. The brain gives experience its human form, your memories, your habits, your language, your personality. Destroy the structure, and that form is lost. But whether the underlying light is lost is another question entirely. Most neuroscientists would say this is elegant language without evidence. And they are right to be cautious. The receiver model is attractive partly because it offers psychological comfort. It leaves the door open. It can be made to harmonize with spirituality, mystical states, and the fear that annihilation might not be the end of the story. That very attractiveness is a reason to distrust it. Science has to be careful around ideas people badly want to be true. But caution cuts both ways. The generator model is also attractive. It is clean, modern, mechanistic. It keeps everything inside the laboratory. It tells a story the contemporary mind finds respectable. That is not a refutation either. A view can be culturally satisfying and still incomplete. The fairest thing we can say is this: the mainstream model remains powerful, but not fully closed. It still has the advantage in everyday explanatory strength. Brain injuries matter, chemistry matters, neural networks matter. Consciousness is entangled with the brain so intimately that no honest view can deny it. At the same time, the hard problem remains unsolved. Terminal lucidity remains deeply puzzling, and near-death experiences continue to raise questions about the limits of ordinary models. The cracks are not enough to demolish the house, but they are enough to remind us that the house is not finished. And once you admit that, the emotional texture of the death question changes. If the brain is only a generator, then death appears straightforward. The organ fails, the product ends, and the silence that follows is final. If the brain is also a receiver or filter, then death looks different. The receiver breaks. The local signal vanishes. The person, in the ordinary human sense, may still be lost. But the possibility emerges that what consciousness fundamentally is does not reduce as easily as we hoped or feared. That possibility is the threshold we are standing on now. Not proof, not doctrine, not certainty. A threshold. And once the conversation reaches that threshold, it becomes almost impossible to avoid the strangest frontier of all: the attempt to connect consciousness not merely to biology, but to the deepest physics of reality itself. There is a reason this is the point in the story where many scientists begin to get uncomfortable. Up to now, we have remained close to recognizable territory. Brainwaves, oxygen loss, neurochemistry, medical case reports. Even the older religious maps, however strange, could still be treated as cultural interpretations of a universal human event. But once the conversation reaches quantum consciousness, the ground changes. The language becomes more speculative, the evidence more contested, and the stakes much larger. Because if consciousness has roots deeper than ordinary neural computation, then death may not be as simple as the destruction of a machine. The best-known attempt to make that case came from an unlikely partnership. One of the two men was Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist whose work on black holes and general relativity helped earn him the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020. The other was Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist who spent years thinking about one of the strangest medical facts in all of neuroscience. A patient can remain biologically alive under anesthesia while consciousness disappears almost completely and then later returns. Together, they proposed a theory with a name that sounds technical enough to keep most people at a distance: orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCH-OR. What made the theory famous was not its name, it was its claim. Consciousness, they argued, may not arise primarily from the large-scale computation of neurons talking to one another across synapses, the way most mainstream neuroscience assumes. Instead, it may depend on quantum processes occurring inside tiny structural elements within neurons called microtubules. At first glance, microtubules seem like an odd place to look for the secret of consciousness. They are part of the cell's internal skeleton, long protein cylinders that help maintain shape, transport materials, and organize cellular life. For decades, they were treated mostly as structural supports, microscopic beams and scaffolding. Hameroff suspected they were more than that. He noticed that some anesthetic agents appeared to interact with proteins associated with microtubules. That did not prove anything by itself, but it suggested a provocative possibility. If consciousness vanishes under anesthesia, while many basic neural functions continue, perhaps the critical mechanism of consciousness lies deeper than ordinary network signaling. Perhaps it is linked to something happening inside the neurons themselves. Penrose brought a very different problem into the picture. He had long been dissatisfied with the standard interpretation of how the quantum world becomes the classical world we experience. In quantum mechanics, systems can exist in superpositions, multiple possible states at once, until some event leads to a definite outcome. Penrose proposed that this transition might involve an objective physical process tied to the structure of space-time itself, not merely a vague act of measurement in the ordinary sense. He called this objective reduction. When Penrose's idea was combined with Hameroff's interest in microtubules, the resulting theory suggested that tiny quantum superpositions might occur inside neuronal microtubules, evolve in an orchestrated way, and then collapse into definite states that correspond to moments of conscious experience. That is the core intuition of ORCH-OR. The conscious moment is not just a byproduct of information processing. It is a real physical event at the boundary between quantum possibility and classical reality. In this picture, awareness is not merely what complex neurons compute. It is linked to the deepest fabric of the universe. That is exactly why the theory attracted so much attention. It offered something most theories of consciousness do not: a bridge, however controversial, between subjective experience and fundamental physics. It also attracted intense criticism. The most common objection was brutally simple. The brain is warm, wet, noisy, and chemically active. Quantum coherence is fragile. It tends to break down quickly when systems interact with their environment. So, how could delicate quantum states survive long enough inside the biological chaos of the brain to matter for consciousness? For years, many physicists and neuroscientists treated this as fatal. The theory was seen by critics as imaginative, elegant, and highly unlikely. And that may still be the mainstream view. But the landscape has shifted enough that the idea can no longer be dismissed with quite the same confidence. Over the last few decades, quantum biology has become a legitimate field. Researchers have found evidence that certain biological systems may exploit quantum effects under ordinary temperatures, including processes in photosynthesis, bird navigation, and possibly olfaction. That does not prove the brain does the same thing, but it weakens the old easy objection that biology and quantum effects simply do not mix. Then there is the growing interest in microtubules themselves. A number of experimental results, though still debated, have kept the conversation alive. Some studies have suggested that stabilizing microtubules can alter how quickly consciousness is lost under anesthesia in animal models. Other work has argued that microtubules may support more complex electrical or quantum-like behavior than once believed. None of this has established OR as fact, but it has made the theory harder to wave away as pure fantasy. This is why the theory remains important even for people who do not accept it. It asks the forbidden question seriously. What if consciousness is not just software running on wet neural hardware? What if at least part of consciousness is tied to physical processes deeper than classical computation? What if subjective experience is not an emergent accident at the top of the biological hierarchy, but something woven more fundamentally into reality itself? These questions matter enormously for the topic of death. Because if consciousness is nothing more than large-scale neural computation, then death looks straightforward. The network collapses. The process ends. Whatever the self was, it was dependent on the intact function of the system, and once the system is irreversibly gone, so is the self. But if consciousness depends in part on quantum information or quantum processes that are not easily reduced to ordinary classical breakdown, then the picture becomes less simple. Here, the language often becomes slippery, and it is important not to claim more than the evidence allows. Quantum information theory does include the principle that information is not casually erased from the universe. In the deepest formulations of physics, information is conserved in ways that have led to fierce debates about black holes, entropy, and the fate of physical states. Some people hear this and leap immediately to the idea that personal consciousness must therefore survive death. That leap is too fast. The preservation of information in a mathematical or physical sense is not the same thing as the preservation of a person in the ordinary, intimate, first-person sense. The fact that information is not simply annihilated does not automatically mean your memories, your identity, your felt self remain intact after biological death. Those are very different claims. Still, the theory opens a door that strict materialism tries to keep shut. Hameroff himself has speculated that if consciousness involves quantum information in microtubules, then the information associated with conscious experience may not simply vanish when the body dies. If a patient is revived, perhaps some of that information is reintegrated, contributing to the report of a near-death experience. If the patient is not revived, perhaps the information dissipates into a larger physical reality. Penrose has generally been more careful and less willing to use soul-like language, but the broad implication remains. If consciousness has roots in fundamental physics, then death may be more complicated than simple extinction. That is the terrifying attraction of quantum consciousness. Not that it proves immortality, not that it solves the afterlife, but that it reopens the possibility that mind and matter are related in a deeper way than 20th century neuroscience assumed. And once that possibility is reopened, even slightly, the old confidence begins to wobble. The clean sentence, "the brain dies, therefore consciousness ends," starts to sound less like a demonstrated fact and more like a summary we adopted before the underlying mystery was understood. This is why quantum consciousness remains so compelling, even to many people who doubt it. It is not compelling because it is settled. It is compelling because it touches the largest unfinished connection in science, the connection between subjective experience and the basic structure of reality. Whether OR turns out to be right, partly right, or completely wrong, the question it forces us to face is still here. If consciousness reaches deeper into the universe than we thought, then death may not be the simple vanishing act we once imagined. There is one more idea waiting at the far edge of this discussion, and it is the kind of idea that makes careful people uneasy for good reason. Not because it is silly, because it is enormous. It asks whether we may have been thinking about reality backwards, whether consciousness is not a late product of matter, but something more primary, something the universe does not merely produce, but depends on. This family of ideas is often grouped under labels like biocentrism or observer-centered reality, and the broad intuition behind them is simple to state and very hard to digest. Maybe the observer is not a minor side effect inside the cosmos. Maybe the observer is built into the structure of the cosmos from the start. Part of the appeal comes from quantum mechanics, especially the old discomfort surrounding measurement and observation. At the quantum level, systems can exist in superpositions, multiple possible states at once, until an interaction yields a definite outcome. Popular culture often turns this into the claim that consciousness creates reality, which goes much farther than most physicists are willing to go. Still, the presence of the observer problem has kept the philosophical door open wider than many people would prefer. Add to this Einstein's block universe picture of time, where past, present, and future are not flowing in the common sense way they feel to us, but exist within a larger space-time structure. Add to the many worlds interpretation, in which quantum events do not collapse into a single outcome, so much as branch into multiple realized possibilities. Once those ingredients are on the table, some thinkers begin to ask an unnerving question. If reality is already stranger than ordinary intuition allows, why assume death is experienced the way common sense says it should be? That is where the most radical speculation appears. In certain versions of this thinking, death may be real for the body in one frame, yet not experienced as an absolute ending by consciousness itself. If reality branches, if time is not what it seems, if observer and world are more entangled than classical physics suggested, then the finality we imagine may be more local than absolute. Not false exactly, but incomplete. This is the seductive core of the idea, sometimes summarized as death is an illusion. It is important to be careful here. This is not settled science. It is not a consensus view in physics, neuroscience, or philosophy of mind. Most researchers would say correctly that these theories stretch beyond the evidence. The role of observation in quantum mechanics does not automatically mean human consciousness generates reality. Many worlds does not automatically imply personal survival. The block universe does not automatically rescue the self from mortality. These are leaps, and science has every right to resist them. But even resisted ideas can be revealing. They show where the pressure points are. They show where ordinary material explanations stop feeling emotionally and intellectually complete to some people. They show how quickly the question of death turns into a question about the architecture of reality itself. That is why this remains fascinating even when it remains speculative. It does not give us permission to claim victory over death. It gives us permission to admit that the deepest frameworks of modern science are stranger than the simple story most of us grew up with. The story where matter is basic, consciousness is secondary, and death is a clean endpoint may still prove right. But at this point in the inquiry, it is no longer the only imaginable story. There is one place where science becomes firm again, not on the fate of the soul, not on near-death experiences, not on whether consciousness survives, on something simpler, older, and far more certain. The material of you does not vanish. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy is not created or destroyed, it changes form. The atoms in your body obey the same rule. They do not disappear when life ends. They leave the pattern that held them together as a person, but they do not leave the universe. That distinction matters, because what dies may be the arrangement, the voice, the memory, the private point of view that called itself I, but the substance itself remains. The carbon in your muscles, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the oxygen moving through your lungs, none of it is lost. It is released, redistributed, and returned to the wider system that made you possible in the first place. And those atoms were ancient long before they became you. The hydrogen in your body was born near the beginning of the universe. The heavier elements were forged inside stars and scattered through space by stellar death. You are not metaphorically made of stardust. You are literally built from the remains of earlier cosmic events. Your body is a temporary arrangement of very old matter, gathered for a while into a living form capable of memory, love, fear, and thought. Then the arrangement changes. Burial returns the body through soil, water, microbes, roots, and time. Cremation returns it through heat, air, ash, and atmosphere. Either way, the same truth remains. You re-enter the world. Matter becomes available again. Energy disperses. The body feeds larger cycles already in motion. In that sense, death is not only ending, it is participation. Nature does not keep the shape, but it keeps the substance. What was once held inside skin becomes part of earth, weather, plants, and other living things. The universe does not preserve you in the way grief wants, but it does not throw you away either. That is one of the few things we can say without hesitation. Whatever consciousness turns out to be, whatever survives or does not survive, the physical universe is astonishingly reluctant to lose anything at all. So, where does all of this leave us? It leaves us in the most honest place science can offer. We know that the brain can remain startlingly active near death. We know that some people who return from the edge report experiences that are structured, vivid, and life-changing. We know that chemistry, memory, and perception all behave strangely under extreme biological stress. We know that human cultures across history have kept returning to the same basic shape: a passage, a guide, a reckoning, a continuation, or an ending. We know that consciousness is still not fully explained, and we know with complete certainty that the material of you is never simply erased. What we do not know is the answer people want most. We do not know whether consciousness survives the death of the brain. We do not know whether near-death experiences are the final brilliance of a dying nervous system, a doorway into something beyond it, or some combination we do not yet have the language to describe. We do not know whether death is a wall, a door, or a corridor, but one truth survives every possibility. This life matters. If death is the end, then this brief chance to love, to notice, to forgive, to be kind, to sit beneath a night sky, and wonder at your own existence is more precious than words can hold. And if death is a transition, if something of you continues, then how you live still matters just as much. The weight of your actions matters. The love you gave matters. The harm you refuse to pass on matters. Either way, your life is not small. If this journey through science, consciousness, and the mystery of death gave you something to think about tonight, gently like the video, subscribe to the Quantum Slumber and tell me in the comments what you believe happens after we die. Thank you for spending this time with me. Now, let your thoughts grow quieter. Let the questions loosen their grip. Let the night hold what it does not yet answer. And wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope sleep comes gently. Good night.